everyone, we're going to try video notes this week and see if they're a little bit more successful than last week. Obviously, if you have questions, comments, concerns, or you just want to continue this discussion, find me on Twitter. So we're going to talk about the mediated notes chapters 3 through 7, and what I'm going to highlight specifically are not the individual characteristics of each article, but the overall global connections amongst all of these particular pieces. So what we'll notice for ties between all of these readings is that all of them are exploring the idea of civic identity, civic learning, and meaning making. And what they're all essentially getting at is that through media, so we as mediated citizens or mediatized citizens make sense of information, we make sense of knowledge, we make our own knowledge, and we make sense of our subject position within civics in relation to what we see on the media. This is really important for our overall degree program of rhetoric, writing, and digital media studies, because this is what we're asking freshmen to do in freshman composition, is to make sense of their place as little freshmen within the larger global picture. So when we're talking about meaning making, we really are talking about the rhetorical structures, the rhetorical engagement with all of these ideas that are floating around us and all of the ways that they're floating around us. So what we see in this particular case and in all of these chapters is we use media to do it. So my big question with this overall tie, if I Googled, which I did, the top news correspondents, and this is essentially who I got. What's wrong with this picture? How am I supposed to make sense of the knowledge that's coming at me, the information that's coming at me? What happened or what could happen if I weren't white? How would I then try to relate to these people who are delivering this information to me or who are expecting me to make meaning in very specific ways based on how they're discussing this particular news? So how does this particular picture influence how I then make meaning, and what are those individual practices that I engage in, and how could they be shaped? So those are the ideas that these chapters take on. Schwartz starts off by talking about the railroad crash and what that meant for people who were impacted by it, or for people who possibly had family who were impacted by it, and the relationship between the individual citizens and their government as it was shown through media. Schwartz starts off by throwing out a whole lot of names. He is something of a name dropper. So he talks about Habermas, Foucault, Reingold, Jenkins. He has a couple of others, but they're less important as far as digital media studies goes. So for digital media studies, a lot of the initial theory started off with Habermas. So Habermas conceptualized public spheres and then the resulting private sphere. There is a ridiculous amount of very, very important feminist critique on these two conceptualizations, because the public sphere becomes not just how do we speak when we're in civic life, how do we speak in relation to civic life, but also who can speak. So there is a Foucault critique of Habermas that has a lot to do with power and who has access to speak. So in combining Habermas and Foucault in this particular article, what Schwartz can really get at is, in this particular government, as it's played out in Argentina, who has access to media? What does the media actually discuss as the representation of public civic life? And then what is it that people found through social media, that they explored through social media, that became politically legitimate and relevant to really question what the media was actually doing? And we see this not just in Argentina in this particular case, but we see this consistently throughout. We're seeing it especially now with the presidential election in the United States. How do bloggers influence the discussion? How does Twitter influence the discussion? And then how do those social media pieces influence what politicians do? How do what politicians do then influence social media? It is a two-way street, and we can't always say which came first, the chicken or the egg. The other two big names that Schwartz throws out are Reingold and Jenkins, both of whom talk specifically about community membership, both of whom have very, very idealistic, positive views of community. Anytime somebody's online speaking to other people, everything must be good with the world. That is an overly idealistic critique of both Reingold and Jenkins, because they do raise really important questions, but for the most part, their points are engaging communities online because they can do really good things. So Schwartz brings these two sets of ideas together within his particular example to say, if we have people engaging online, what happens politically, what happens civically, and what does that make for how individuals, or what does that mean for how individuals make sense of themselves as Argentinians? We're going to see this picked up by every single author. So Naioli I'm terrible with names, talks about the historic ties between media and civic life, and in this case, civic life may or may not be democracy, but the idea that there is assumed by almost all people across the entire world, we assume that there is a tie between media and civic life. Civic life becomes attached to media. Civic life is made sense of through media. Civic life is seen as important, or priorities are prioritized based on what media covers and what media coverage does. So the questions that are raised in this particular article are, have social expectations changed because of engagement with social media? And we're trying to explore those still, because there is no answer to that question. Engagement in transparent communication, is that happening more or less? What does that mean? What does that look like? So if we look at this and apply it specifically to the United States, are we more or less transparent since Snowden? Since he pointed out and since he released all of this information, and then there was all of the hoopla in relation to where is he, was he supposed to do this, what should we do with whistleblowers, that was really an engagement between, yes, privacy, and yes, what the government can and can't do, but it was also a really interesting moment where we were exploring what happens to our mediated selves when we're trying to be a member of this civic society, when this is what we see on media, and it's media specifically that's being critiqued, as well as government specifically that's being critiqued. What do we do? So are we more or less transparent now? Again, there's no easy answer to this question, but it's a really important question to raise. And while she used a specific case study, it's not specific to that case study. This is a nationwide or a worldwide question to be raised. Online transactions, and do we want to hear or be heard? So to what extent do citizens want to engage with media to produce their own media? So the proliferation of blogs in the United States, especially political blogs, is an indication that Americans want to both hear and be heard, and they want to participate in civic life. They're just not exactly sure how to engage in this particular mediated instance. Next, we talk about Farah, who's dealing specifically with Lebanese camps. So in this case, she finds two distinct camps. We have people who live in camps and people who live outside the camps, and how they interact with media and how they mediate their lives. And the really important idea that is raised here is the idea of national identity. How does media set the agenda for our national identity? How do we understand our national identity through media? So again, we're in an election cycle here in the United States, and so we have a lot of GOP debates that are happening, and pretty soon we're going to see the Democrats also debating. How do these two parties, what they raise, what they care about, the discussions afterwards, how do all of those things help us as individuals make sense of our own national identity? So one of the conversations we're seeing happening right now is, in the last GOP debate, all of the Republicans said they wanted to defund Planned Parenthood, but then all of the political correspondents are saying 85% of Americans do not want the government shut down over something like that. So we have a disconnect between what the politicians are discussing, what they're claiming to be important, how the media is interpreting that, and then what individuals actually feel about that entire situation. Again, there's no right or wrong answer with any of this, but all of these come together to make a very complex context for us to make sense of who we are as Americans, what it means to be American, and what our national identity actually is. So the big question raised in this chapter is, what does it mean to be insert any answer here. Even something like a college student. What does it mean to be a college freshman when it's mediatized? How is that displayed in movies? How is that critiqued in movies? How is it privileged in movies? How do we understand all of that? And then what happens when that freshman actually shows up at their dorm? How do they make sense of all of this? Or if they're at a community college, how do they make sense of themselves as a college freshman in a community college? So how do we put all of this together because of what media has shown us? Chapter 6, we jump to Greece. So in Greece, there are obviously a lot of economic issues that are driving a lot of their attachments, and what especially this particular researcher is looking at is how can we use social media to engage people with physical public space again. So again, we're making a lot of assumptions about what it means to be a civic participant and what it means to engage in civic life, and in this case, the engagement with physical public spaces is really important to make sense of national identity and to make sense of what civic life means, and for individuals to engage with all of that. And the whole purpose behind that is public space offers a place of socialization. So a part of what we're dealing with specifically is the idea of public space and socialization. So how much do we understand how much meaning making and meaning making praxis? So praxis, back from the very first chapter, we have a combination of practices as well as theory. When we put those two ideas together, how do we learn to make meaning? How are we taught to make meaning as we engage in public spaces? And that's the aspect of socialization that's being focused on specifically here. How do we get a new generation to make meaning in a new way that's in a more positive direction for democracy, for economy, and for globalization? How do we put all of that together by using social media to re-engage with public space, to re-socialize, or to socialize differently? And the really important part here is, in order to socialize differently, you have to have citizen buy-in. If the citizens aren't willing to create a new historical narrative, to reread what it means to be an American, to be a Greek, to be insert whatever identity here, if you don't have that buy-in, then that national narrative is not going to take off. So how do you re-engage citizens with a public space so that they can make meaning in a different way? And again, it's the meaning making that's tied back to the rhetoric that makes this so important. How do we teach people to make meaning? As we move on, the last chapter from this particular section is on the China and their relationship with health and information about health. So what we're really seeing here is that we're not just dealing with government, we're dealing with health, government, civic engagement, and then again, media, meaning-making practices, how all of these things come together. The really important thing that I want to point out about this chapter is that Bogan points out that people engaged in these online spaces learn a Western communication style from their online engagement because they're specifically engaging with argument form and supporting details. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing can easily be heavily debated. What I want to point out here is that when we look to these particular environments, and kind of the whole reason that digital media studies is so important to current conceptualizations of writing studies as well as teaching composition courses, is because we're engaged in practices online. The more we know about these particular practices, the more we understand how we do or don't value these practices, the better we can help students understand context, understand the rhetorical situation, so they can understand audience, context, purpose, so they can then write better. So in this particular case, I would have a slight critique for Bogan, because it's not, unless we self-reflect on some of these ideas, we may not understand that we're learning argument form or supporting detail. And in saying that, yay, they learned this stuff, we're overvaluing this Western communication style, which for American students or even Chinese students who are studying abroad in America could be really important. But that doesn't mean that it's the right way to understand or the right way to make sense. Engagement in these forums may be the right way, especially because it caused change in what the media did and did not start to inform people about, but that doesn't mean that the style has to be overvalued in this particular way. So we want to really look at and consider how style in some of these situations comes out. So overall, what we're looking at with these chapters is, if we look at the entire world, how are individuals who claim to be citizens of specific countries engaging in civic life, especially given the globalization of the entire world? How do they make sense of government? How do they make sense of self-identity? And then what writing, reading, sense-making practices do they engage in at that point to make sense of all of this, or which ones are they forced to learn in order to continue to be an engaged citizen? And we're going to extrapolate that information for the final project that you guys will be starting in about 2 weeks. So how do we make sense through online forums? How do we teach sense-making or meaning-making through these particular forums? And then what does that mean? What is it possibly privileging, and what is it not teaching citizens that they possibly need to know? If you have any questions, obviously send me a tweet, and I will see you guys in the discussion boards.